While this series of presentations is dedicated to Western Christian architecture, I feel that its 6th century Eastern Empire structure is so important in the pantheon of Christian buildings and is so far advanced of contemporary Western architecture, I feel it necessary to include it in this discussion of Western Christian buildings. This will be a cursory look at the very important Christian church deserving several presentations detailing its importance in world history. See the look at the top of the icon of Christ. It says 2,000 years of Western Christian architecture. Then if you look below the icon, it says presentation number 5. Hagia Sophia, which means sacred wisdom in Greek. Builder of that Christian church was built in the East, and he's famous for saying, "I've outdone thee, Solomon," thinking after he built Hagia Sophia, he had done better than Solomon's first temple in Jerusalem. So let's get started. Okay, so Roman Empire has fallen. The Emperor Romulus Augustulus is shown here handing over the seal of Rome to the barbarian conqueror. And while this was going on in 476 AD, there's a town called Byzantium, which became Constantinople in 330, and it flourished until 1453 when the Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople, and it became eventually Istanbul, which is the name it has today. But anyway, this was a very flourishing metropolis. It was the heart of Eastern Christianity. And the reason I'm bringing it in is such an important building, even though it doesn't belong in the Western lexicon, so to speak, but it deserves some mention. So I squeezed this in ahead of my Romanesque presentation. Hope I have time to do everything tonight. This is the medieval timeline, and we're going to be looking at the Great Migration, the Dark Ages, the end of that, and then we're going to move over to the Romanesque. You can see in that bottom yellow thing there. What's interesting about the Romanesque is not much really happened, and there was something right here called the Millennium. A lot of Europeans, Christians, thought that the world was coming to an end, so why bother building churches? And that really, I think, had an effect on the architecture in the West. But this, nevertheless, Hagia Sophia was built in Constantinople in 532 AD, and it's one of Christendom's greatest buildings, and it still exists. And it's an incredible building when you think about the technology that built it. A stone building pushed to the nth degree in the fashion that the Eastern churches developed. So last week we talked a little bit about the martyrs being really heavily centered towards the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire, not so much, even though there were martyrs certainly across the whole empire. And on this side, we had a liturgical basilica, which is a simple diagram here where there's a side aisle, a nave, another side aisle. It might be 4 side aisles total in a nave. And then at the rear, there's an altar with a semicircular apse, usually a half dome on top of that called an exedra, a sidra, and a narthex. And the Byzantine Greek plan isn't too much different than this one, except they thickened up these columns and made them piers, and they put a dome over it, but you can see they both had side aisles. Their origin was martyrial. They focused on the tombs of saints, specifically the martyrs who had died during the persecutions. They copied earlier pagan tombs that were roofed over by a symbolic dome of heaven. That dome of heaven is a consistent theme throughout the East, but not so much in the West. St. Peter's in Rome is an interesting example of, it started out as a liturgical basilica, as a tomb of martyr St. Peter, and then they tore it down and rebuilt it as one of these domes. Okay, so the liturgical basilica, it has a cruciform plan, and you can see the almost equilateral legs of the cross with the Byzantine Greek plan with
But in both cases, the altar and the apse are towards the rear. And in the Byzantine plan, the Dome of Heaven is central to the crossing. And these are just some examples of the various floor plans that have developed over time. They all feature, you can see here, some sort of dome over usually a square shape. You can see, wherever you see a dome in plan, you'll see 4 piers or columns or walls or something that form that square. The photograph from very early in the Byzantine Empire, and you can see that you can't see here but it's on a square. It has a drum and then the dome on top, and you can see a newer version of that. They didn't rely on the clear story that we're going to be talking about. They pushed the dome up and let light in underneath the dome. As you can see here at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, this is called the Church of Gold because it's just filled with gold mosaics. I want you to take a look at these 4 corners. There are 4 arches around this dome that form the square. And then these funny shaped little pieces right in here are called pendentives. This is what a pendentive looks like. And what it is, you can see the square over here, and then the dome, the round dome, or the drum sitting on top of it. And if you take that pendentive and pull it away, what it is, it's the transition, the way they transition from the square to the circle. And the square is hard to see here because of the distortion, but the edge of this arch and these 4 arches surrounding this dome form a square space. And then the pendentives are these kind of warped triangles in each corner, and they become very significant because they're always full of iconography. And one thing I want you to keep in mind as we look at these earlier churches all the way through the Renaissance, the images are all in their discrete spaces for the most part. They don't, this saint's not vying with this saint for space between, each one is in their separate little quadrant or pie-shaped thing, as are the pendentives. So everything's neat and orderly right now. So that's a pendentive, and those are the 4 pendentives to one of the domes in St. Mark's. Like I said, this isn't about the Eastern Church, so I wanted just to go over it really quickly. You can see the dome at the crossing, the Greek cross, how it looks up here in a cutaway, and you can see more examples of the domes, central domes. And this Dome of Heaven, they're called, and with Christ in there. Okay, so summary of the Eastern Church, just so we talked about it, it's a basilica plan, but it's modified with a dome becoming a plan for the Eastern churches. It's the Dome of Heaven at the crossing, and it's a stone ribbed dome. You can see the stone ribs here, which are the structure, and then these stone spandrels between. And that's important as we get into the Renaissance. And the Roman round arches are used throughout the church, the windows, there's no pointed arches. And the pendentive, which is the important transition from the square base to the round dome. Constantine has stopped the persecution of the Christians. And so life goes on in the Roman Empire, even though Constantine has moved the focus to Byzantium. And so the things are going okay, but the barbarians are literally at the gates. And then along comes Emperor Theodosius the Great. He established Nicene Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. He was the last emperor to rule over the entire Roman Empire. After his death, his 2 sons ruled the Eastern Byzantine and the Western Roman empires. So I just wanted to bring Theodosius up because a lot of people mistakenly think that Constantine made Christianity the official religion. Evidently, he had a deathbed version to Christianity, but he just stopped the persecution. The 2 sons, Arcadius and Honorius, respectively in Constantinople and in Rome. So when they took over, the empire was split between the 2, East and West. The Roman Empire fell during 476. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantine Empire was flourishing with great wealth, powerful armies, a well-educated elite which governed the country, growing libraries, and a building program that only great wealth can bring. The Emperor Justinian I reigned as the emperor from 527 to 565 here in Constantinople, and this was his territory. And he built this place called Hagia Sophia, which means sacred wisdom. This is an isometric sketch or a rendering of that church. And what I wanted to bring out right now, because it's going to affect the rest of Christian architecture also in the West as well as the East, is their focus was on the interior. If you look at this, this is kind of jumble of shapes. It's interesting in itself, but it's not particularly religious or irreligious. It's just, I've discovered this is a diagram or structure to control the forces of what it takes to make the interior. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago where the religion was practiced in front of temples. Now we've gone with the Christ crucifixion, we've gone inside. And that inside now becomes the focus of Christian architecture. So what we're seeing on the outside is the structure that is used to control the forces that are created by the stone structures inside. And I think it's pretty remarkable that they did this in the 6th century. This is really an incredible building. Okay, so Hagia Sophia, it was an Eastern Orthodox church from 537 to 1453. That's when Mehmed II laid siege and took over Constantinople. Constantinople was sacked during the Fourth Crusade because I think it was the Third Crusade. Constantinople wouldn't help out with the money needed to pay off the Muslims that had captured the wealthy crusaders. And so the French started a Fourth Crusade and they sacked Constantinople to help themselves to some of that wealth. And as a result, it became a Roman Catholic church for about 55 years or so. It was captured by the Ottoman Turks in 453 and it became a mosque until 1931. And from 1935 to 2020, it was a museum, and now it's back to being a mosque, but also a museum. The minarets, there's 4 minarets at the 4 corners of this. They've been photoshopped out. Okay, so since the veil was torn from the top to bottom of the crucifixion, the emphasis on the interior of the church, the exterior appearance was largely results of controlling the structural forces used to create dynamic interior spaces. Okay, so you can see here, there's basically a square plan. You can see these piers. This is the inside of Hagia Sophia, and you can see this is the Dome of Heaven, the big dome. But there's also these other half domes, and those are used to control the forces of this massive dome on the inside. But nevertheless, we have aisles, a nave, the apse, and another aisle, and the narthex. A baptistry is built off to the side, which was common in the early churches. There's the apse and the nave in the north and south aisles. So it's back to the basilica plan, but it's deformed now in the east. And the altars at the end, the thing called the ambo is those stairs that go up to like a pulpit. I think they're still in use in the Catholic Church, not so much anymore. The cruciform plan now is modified for this huge martyrial dome, a dome to the martyrs, and there's the Greek plan and the Dome of Heaven. And this is what it looks like if you cut through that plan and look towards the apse. So even though this looks different, the basic layout is still the Roman basilica. There's the nave, there's the side aisles, there's the triforium, those galleries, as they're called, the altar, the apse, the exedra, and then the Dome of Heaven. The Dome of Heaven, of course, wasn't part of the basilica, but everything up to the Dome of Heaven is straight out of the Roman basilica that Constantine selected as a prototype. Then we have the Dome of Heaven, and then the pendentives that support the Dome of Heaven, or make the transition from the square to the round circular dome. This is that pretty much the same section. This, I just want to alert you that the dome that you saw in the section cut is off the screen up here at the top. This is a half dome. This is one of the arches that support the big dome. So the big dome's not in this photograph, but we have the nave. This is the actual photograph of what it looks like a few years ago. Side aisles, the triforium, the altar, the apse, the exedra, and the Dome of Heaven, which is not visible in this photograph. The other thing is, just to give you an idea of where this triforium was located and how the parts fit together, here's the plan again with the cross, the Greek cross here. The triforium is above the side aisles and also a little bit along the ends. And so this is the triforium, the gallery level, which mimics the Roman basilica. And you'll see this as either a blind gallery or a very narrow gallery or a full walking gallery like this one. It's usually above the side aisles. Here's the triforium gallery. This is an older picture of it. You'll notice there's some iron rods here. This part of the world is prone to earthquakes. You'll see also in some of the columns, if you go there, there's steel banding around them because they've been shaken. And so they were there just a little while ago, and one or two of the columns look like they were really tilted badly. Anyway, it's survived all these years. Quite amazing. And this is the Great Dome itself, the interior and the exterior view of it. Here's the exterior, interior. This is not a small dome, and they built this in the 6th century. This is actually the 3rd dome. 2 have cracked, primarily because of earthquakes, and they've reconstructed them and reinforced them. There's the Roman arches, typical for Byzantine architecture even to this day, the rib vaulting, and the pendentives. And one of the last things I want to say is there's a lot to say about this church. I can go on for probably several hours. I'm not going to do that because, again, this is out of the Western view, but it's an important building. And one of the things this church is most famous for are the beautiful mosaics. And these are incredible. When you look here's a mosaic of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And if you look at the detail, this is mosaics. This is like a watercolor almost. And these are all individual stones that make up this beautiful portrait of the Holy Mother and Jesus Christ. And just to give you a scale in the size of this place, there's the Statue of Liberty with room above her torch. If you ever get to Istanbul, this is the place to go. But nothing with the scale and complexity and beauty of Hagia Sophia appeared in the Western Empire for another 650 years. So think about that. While guys in the West were painting themselves blue and wearing animal skins, these people were building enormous, fantastic structures, building libraries, keeping the ancient Greek culture alive, philosophy and learning and so forth. And we owe them a debt of gratitude, like a bridge between the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance when that started to come back. And there it is without the minarets. And I just love this quote, and this is the Emperor Justinian. He says, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." In other words, you take that, I'm better than you are. Pretty prideful. Anyway, we have this as a cultural heritage to the world. And if you get to Istanbul, definitely stop by there and take a look.
I hope you enjoyed the presentation, Hagia Sophia. Please join me in viewing the 6th presentation, the Romanesque, as we return to the West and begin an in-earnest look at the earliest churches and how the need to protect the wood truss roof from fire became a structural as well as a spiritual problem to be solved over the next several hundreds of years, culminating in the great mystical Gothic cathedrals. Kindly leave any comments or questions you may have below.